evidence left behind, such as the murder weapon. Still, Mr. Ward found that the Kenyan police threw away some key evidence, whilst they had shipped some contaminated items to the UK for analysis. The sketchy actions continued as a former Kenyan Assistant Commissioner of Police, an Englishman himself, Dr. David Rowe, tried to persuade Mr. Ward that lightning and hyenas were his daughter's killers. The coroner in the 2004 inquest referred to this version of the story as absolute nonsense. Jonathan Ward's attempts to get justice for his daughter were met with defiance. He has spent over £2 million with over 200 visits to Kenya. He hit a brick wall at every turn. It took 12 months for the Kenyan government to classify the case as murder. Why? One wonders. There are many unanswered questions. There were, however, witnesses of varying degrees. Park rangers, when interviewed, were terrified. Of what? No one can tell. Why were they scared? Furthermore, a former Kenyan intelligence officer who witnessed the gang rape and subsequent murder of Julie said, "All three men repeatedly raped the British tourist in turn as she pleaded for mercy. The things that I saw will live with me until I die." The Kenyan intelligence officer no longer lived in Kenya and was best positioned to shed light on that night. Still, he didn't elaborate or go into the full details of Julie's murder, despite Mr. Ward's imploring him to come forward. We don't know who the three men were, nor do we know what the intelligence officer meant. Why couldn't both the British and the Kenyan government interview him? The MI6 was also alleged to be involved, as an agent stationed in Kenya admitted his involvement in the case within days of the tragic murder and testified to have met with his Kenyan contact, Mr. David Rowe, despite denying the meeting took place. Why? Mr. Ward believes that there was a clear-cut collision of a cover-up. Dr. Peter Dean, Greater Suffolk coroner at the 2004 inquest, also had similar sentiments and said there had been a blatant and astonishingly clumsy cover-up. The net is closing around those responsible for this awful and brutal crime. Why were there significant discrepancies in the reports? Was the British government colluding with the Kenyan government to cover up Julie's murder? And who were they protecting? Mr. John Ward believes that his daughter was murdered by then Kenya's former president's son, Jonathan Moy. He said Moy and his drunken pals came across Julie when she stopped to photograph the wildlife near the Serena Lodge. Moy then raped her as his cronies stopped farm manager Abraham Klug, stepping in to stop him. Moy's men were then ordered to dispose of her body. Ibrahim Chog was Moy's brother-in-law. Quitting his job with the family, he died in a car accident 10 years later. Ibrahim's father, a former assistant minister in the Kenyan government, also blames Moy for his son's death and the police for covering up. Jonathan Moy was a successful cross-country race driver who won numerous prizes. He had a fallout with his father due to an internal dispute. President Moy divorced his wife and Jonathan Moy chose to stay with his mother. authorities to reopen the case decades later. This has been going on